Welcome to another clinical tip with Zona Physical Therapy. Today we're going to be talking about how back pain can get started. We're going to focus on how that gets going at the disc. There's several different ways that can happen, but we're going to focus on the most common one that we see and the issues that can then lead to down the road. So to get started, let's look at some basic anatomy in the spinal column. So this is an intervertebral disc. The middle of the disc is made up of the nucleus pulposus. So the nucleus pulposus has a texture of like a thick phlegm, to use a pleasant imagery. And then around it is the annulus fibrosus, which is a set of rings that circle around and keep the nucleus pulposus closed, and the annulus fibrosus plays a big role in just bearing load through the spine. You can think of it kind of like a tree trunk, right? So the rings around a tree trunk, and that's basically what it would look like if you were to look down the barrel of the spine. Now, what you don't see in this image, which is a really important structure, and we don't even see it in this image, but I'll just show you where it would be, is what's called the end plate. So it's a cartilaginous structure. The end plate runs across the top here. It doesn't go the entire length of the vertebral body, just a majority of that vertebral body. So there's an end plate at the top of each disc and at the bottom of each disc, and it's the end result of the growth plate of the vertebral body. And that end plate becomes really important because it's actually the weak link of the disc. So the end plate is a very thin and porous structure, and it has to be porous because that's the only way that the disc, especially the nucleus pulposus, can get the nutrients and water that it needs to stay a healthy tissue. Now, what can happen if you get a fracture through that end plate, and a fracture through the end plate usually happens if you just have too much axial compression or axial load through the spine. So that can be anything like carrying something extremely heavy, either in your hands at your side or on your shoulders, or it can happen during a weightlifting movement, or it can be really simple. It can also just be that the end plate has weakened over time with a lot of repetitive bending, and then you finally stress it one last time when you just bend over to pick up your pencil, something simple like that. Or it can be something extreme, like you're out snowboarding or skiing and land on your butt really hard, and so that's a lot of load that goes through your back. And if you've ever heard a pop or hear someone talking about hearing a pop in their back and then they have pain either immediately after or a little bit later, that's typically a fracture through the end plate. That sound of that pop is what's happening. It's a fracture in the end plate. So, end plate's the weak point. Now, think of the disc as a perfectly pressurized system, almost like a car tire. So if you have load that goes down through the spine, the nucleus pulposus presses out in all directions. So it presses up into the end plate that's above it, it presses down into the end plate that's below it, and it presses out in all directions into the annular fibrosus until it presses out until the annular fibrosus gets really, really tight. And that's what you want. It keeps the system very stable, just like a car tire. So you get pressure through the tire from the car itself and from the road. But if it's well pressurized, then the driving is smooth and stable. If you've ever been in a car where the tire suddenly loses pressure, or one of the tires does, or you hit something and very suddenly lose pressure, you'll notice that either you completely lose control, or it's very difficult to control. Or if it's just a small loss of pressure, you'll notice that it has a bit of a wobble and it is less stable. So the same thing will happen here. So if you get a fracture through the end plate, you lose that perfectly pressurized system, which can lead to further issues if you don't stabilize it voluntarily and correctly using your core musculature. That's something that we'll talk about in another video, how we do that, because that's really important. But this can begin a process of further disc injury and back pain. So what can happen is, and what generally will happen, is that the end plate will then heal over or kind of scar over that fracture, which is a good thing. But if you get enough fractures through the end plate, or big enough fractures through the end plate that then scar over, you actually lose that porous ability of the end plate. So then less nutrients and less water are getting to the nucleus pulposus. And this nucleus pulposus then begins to lose water and becomes less malleable, so it doesn't move as much when pressure goes through the spine. That's an issue because then the annulus fibrosus doesn't have any pressure pushing outward, and keeping it really tight when load is through the spine. So now instead, the layers of the annulus fibrosus can then separate or delaminate under pressure rather than being pressed tightly together. So again, that just decreases the stability of the entire system. And if you get enough of that pressure through the spine, or you're not stabilizing it using your core, then, and this happens over and over again, then the annulus fibrosus will begin to permanently laminate and create what we call fissures or tears through the layers of the annulus fibrosus. Now, the tears and the in-plate fracturing themselves can cause pain because there is nerve innervation along the outside of the annulus. And the more of this kind of degeneration process that happens, the more the nerves actually grow inward into the disc. So the easier it becomes to trigger pain if it's not well controlled and well stabilized. And if you get a big enough fissure, and what people are most familiar with is a disc herniation, right? So you get material from the disc will herniate outward, usually posterior lateral or posterior. And this can create the symptoms that people are most familiar with, where you get radiating pain down the leg and numbness, and it's really miserable. But even just pain triggered from fissures in the annulus fibrosus or fractures in the end plate can be pretty unbearable and can refer pain all the way down to the pelvis area and even into the buttock. Oftentimes you'll start to feel it as like a sharp local, almost thumbprint like pain right around what we call the PSIS, or like right at the pointy part of your pelvis at the bottom of your spine. And then if it stays around long enough, it can really start to become more broad and diffuse and refer down into the buttock. And that's the kind of pain, if you have these fissures just in the disc, we call that internal disc pain or internal disc disruption. That can be really aggravating because you're having all this pain, and if you've had it for a long time, you're probably going to get imaging, and the imaging doesn't show any issues. It doesn't show any herniation, and you're frustrated by that. But in reality, what's going on is you've got damage in the disc itself, and that is enough to trigger pain, but it doesn't show up on an image. So don't fall for that and think that you're crazy if that happens. You're very sane. That's basically the most common type of back pain, and even with pain going down into the buttock. So what we have to do then is stabilize and use our core muscles and our back muscles to stabilize this entire spine system to make up for the fact that the disc itself has lost some of its tissue integrity. That may sound crazy, and you might think that you just have to contract your core at 100% all the time. But that's not the case. What it comes down to is just learning how to coordinate how to use your core and use a very light core contraction to keep your spine stable so that you can do regular daily activities like bending over, reaching for things, tying your shoes without triggering your pain, or more importantly, the activities that you want to do. So whether it's doing heavy squats or running, playing basketball, whatever it may be, you need to use and well coordinate your core so that you can keep your spine stable throughout the length of those activities, so you don't keep re-triggering your pain, that you can stay active and no longer have to fear that you're going to trigger some crazy back pain episode that's going to put you out for several days or weeks. So it all comes down to stability. So we'll work on that and talk about that in upcoming videos, and we work on that really in-depthly and really personally when someone comes in to see us. That's a very vital factor in helping people get out of back pain and stay active with the things that they love to do. That's it for today. For your clinical tip, remember, what's most important? No pain, more gains.